History is usually presented as the tale of thrones, crowns, and wars, but most of what actually formed our world took place away from palaces and courts. Behind the famous names of kings and queens, there were thousands of other women who were not royal or rich, but whose determination, ideas, and bravery altered the fate of nations and cultures. They held on to knowledge during eras of destruction. They resisted injustice when quiet was more secure, and they fostered movements that reshaped society. Their work was seldom recognized during their lifetimes, and oftentimes it was intentionally written from the history books. Yet their legacy endures, woven into the fabric of the world we inhabit today. This video asks you to take a step back from the sparkling tales of monarchs and discover instead the forgotten embroidery of history. We will encounter counselors who guided monarchs behind the scenes, tacticians who never had control but altered the course of wars, artists and philosophers who dared to question conventional truths, and keepers of knowledge who made sure that the knowledge of the past was not forgotten. Their narratives remind us that history is not simply about the people at the top, but about the many who brought culture, justice, and progress forward in ways that continue to speak to us today. By unearthing these quiet lives, we not only accord them the dignity due to them, but also have a clearer view of how common individuals today can influence the future. This is a story about finding the hidden strength of voices that would not be quieted, and learning how their legacy remains significant in our own era. Welcome to our channel Words of Time, and in this video, we'll reveal the forgotten women who made history without crowns, a reminder that the most powerful revolutions start far from the throne. History tends to be reported in a manner that concentrates on a few names and titles. The past, when taught in classrooms or read in books, is inclined to emphasize the rulers, conquerors, queens, and princesses. It is not inaccurate to talk of these women who wore crowns or bore titles, for they did shape decisions, politics, and the lives of many. But the manner in which this emphasis has constructed our history has obscured a more massive tale. For each queenly woman who dominated the headlines, there were thousands of others who lived, labored, thought, produced, and suffered in ways that transformed communities, cultures, and societies. They were not born in palace halls or adorned in gems, but they were just as vital to the human narrative. This forgotten canvas of history is what provides richness to our knowledge of how societies actually operated and how change was actually achieved. The histories of women beyond palace walls are important because they reveal the truth of life outside the palace gates. They testify to how half of humankind survived adversity, resisted domination, supported families, sustained economies, and produced cultural continuity. When history forgets these people, it not only distorts the past, but also belies the truth of human adaptability and ingenuity. To narrate only the tale of the few is to forget the many. When we learn history only from kings, queens, and wars, we omit the webs of effort that enabled survival, the inventions that remade common life, and the ideas that humbly found a hold away from court. Recovery of the lives of non-royal women is not a sentimental exercise. It is an exercise in accuracy, for without them, our image of history is fractured. It may be asked why the history of these stories was neglected in the first instance. Part of the explanation is that those who wrote history were men bound to political and religious institutions. Their interest was not in everyday life, but in those in authority who paid for wars, signed decrees, or shaped dynasties. When scribes decided what to document, they behaved according to a pattern that raised rulers and overlooked workers, healers, teachers, and midwives. Women performing those tasks infrequently left behind texts under their names, since they were not given education, were held back by tradition, or prohibited by legislation. Inability to document was subsequently confused with lack of influence. This produced a cycle in which every generation could look back and assume women who did not wear crowns played no role in the shaping of history. In reality, they were the bedrock of societies, even if the annals did not record this. Take the case of a healer living in a medieval town. She had no title, no land, but she possessed knowledge that saved lives. She might have inherited remedies from her grandmother or mother, transmitting recipes for herbs and wound treatments. During plagues, when fear paralyzed entire communities, these women stood between despair and survival. They were not blessed with statues or chronicles, but their labor changed the course of families and, consequently, entire regions. Visualize midwives who brought children into the world, who grew up to be leaders, artists, and intellectuals. Their hands literally gave way to succeeding generations, but their names are forgotten to us. To disregard their importance is to discount the very process of continuity, which warps the history of human achievement. The same goes for women who worked in fields and marketplaces. Economies are explained through rulers' policies or the emergence of trade routes, but behind these abstractions were women in numbers who planted, spun thread, sold goods, and kept accounts. They ensured households survived hardship and war. Without them, kingdoms would have collapsed from within, for food and clothes were more important to sustenance than decrees. Their work was constant, and it formed the unseen backbone of every great civilization. Yet in the chronicles of wars and alliances, their role is all but invisible. The irony is that their impact was more consistent than that of many rulers whose reigns ended in chaos. When we think of intellectual life, our minds turn to philosophers, poets, and scientists whose works were preserved. Yet scattered throughout history are women who taught children, told stories, and preserved oral traditions. They transmitted not only knowledge, but also identity. In cultures without written language, women were often the keepers of songs and rituals, ensuring that stories of origins and values survived across generations. Even in literate societies, women's influence in shaping the minds of the young was immeasurable. The philosopher or statesman whose name we know once sat at the knee of a mother or a nurse, listening to lessons and absorbing values. To deny the shaping power of those early teachers is to deny the soil in which the seeds of greatness were planted. There are, of course, examples of individual non-royal women who managed to break through the silence of history, giving us glimpses of what so many others must have done. Think of the ancient poet Sappho, whose fragments still reveal the emotional depth of a woman's voice in a world where men dominated literature. She was not a princess, yet her words reached across centuries. Or consider Hypatia of Alexandria, a mathematician and philosopher who taught in a city of scholars. Her life ended in violence, a stark reminder of how dangerous it could be for a woman to claim intellectual authority. Yet her very existence shows us what was possible outside of royal power. These names survive because they were unusual in being recorded, but they should be seen as hints of a much wider pattern of women's activity that has gone unnoticed. The missing pieces in our understanding are not trivial. Without them, we cannot grasp how cultures truly functioned. For example, in the history of exploration, we celebrate sailors and navigators who crossed seas. But we rarely hear of the women who prepared supplies, maintained homes, and sustained communities while men were gone for years. Without their stability, expeditions would have collapsed, because the explorers returned to functioning households that allowed them to continue their work. In the history of revolutions, speeches and battles take center stage, yet in the shadows were women who carried messages, hid fugitives, and kept the fires of resistance alive. Their efforts were quiet, but they were indispensable. By not including them, we tell a story of revolutions that appears spontaneous and heroic, but ignores the long, careful work that made them possible. One way to think about the value of these stories is to imagine a tapestry. The most visible parts of a tapestry are often the figures in the center, the heroes and rulers. But the background threads give shape, color, and meaning to the whole. Without them, the image is incomplete. History has preserved the central figures while allowing the background to fade, but it is the background that reveals the real complexity of life. Women outside the royal sphere form much of that background. Their daily struggles, creativity, and resilience made survival possible and gave depth to human achievement. They deserve recognition not as an act of generosity, but as an act of truth. The importance of recovering these stories extends beyond fairness. It shapes how we understand ourselves today. If history tells us that only those with crowns and armies mattered, then it sends the message that ordinary people cannot shape the world. But if we recognize that countless unnamed women preserved traditions, raised children, managed households, and resisted oppression, then we learn that influence comes in many forms. We also recognize that progress is not only the work of the few, but the work of the many. This broader vision of history encourages us to value all contributions, not only those made in halls of power. There is also a moral responsibility in this recovery. Many women were silenced not by accident, but by design. They were excluded from education, denied property rights, and written out of records. To continue ignoring them today is to accept that injustice. By seeking out their stories, even in fragments, we resist the erasure and affirm that their lives mattered. Each recovered story challenges the old narrative and restores dignity to those who were denied it. Even when we cannot know names or details, we can recognize patterns and acknowledge the invisible labor that sustains societies. Examples help bring this truth to life. In colonial America, women often ran small businesses such as taverns or shops, especially when their husbands died or were away. Their management skills kept families afloat and provided community spaces that shaped local politics. In ancient China, women who were skilled in textile work contributed to one of the most important economic forces in history, the silk trade. Their labor powered a network that connected continents, yet they remain nameless in the grand stories of emperors and generals. In African societies, women who were market leaders wielded real influence in regulating prices and goods, acting as stabilizers of local economies. These cases hint at a vast hidden power that shaped daily life across cultures. The same is true in times of war. During the two world wars, women entered factories, fields, and offices in numbers never seen before. They kept economies running while men fought, and their labor changed the perception of what women could do. This was not entirely new, but it became visible on a scale that could no longer be ignored. The lesson here is that when circumstances forced recognition, the reality of women's power became undeniable. Yet the truth is that similar contributions had always existed, though earlier societies often failed to record them. The world wars simply pulled back the curtain. Another way to understand this hidden power is through cultural production. Women have long been creators of songs, stories, and art that circulated outside formal institutions. Folk songs sung in kitchens, lullabies whispered to children, and embroidery patterns shared across generations carried cultural meaning that shaped identity. These creations may not have been displayed in palaces or museums, but they preserved values and fostered resilience. They are part of the cultural DNA of societies, yet historians often overlook them in favor of grand works by recognized artists. To include them is to acknowledge that culture is not only what elites produce, but what ordinary people create and sustain. Recovering these stories is not easy. Records are scarce, and the traces that survive are often fragmentary. But historians have found ways to read between the lines. Legal documents that mention women only as witnesses or defendants still reveal aspects of their lives. Household accounts, letters, and folk traditions provide clues. Archaeology uncovers tools, textiles, and dwellings that speak of women's labor. Oral history carries memories of grandmothers and great-grandmothers who endured and shaped communities. Piece by piece, the hidden tapestry becomes visible. The work is slow, but the reward is great, because it restores balance to our understanding of humanity. It is important to stress that telling these stories does not diminish the importance of queens and princesses. Their influence was real, and their lives were often remarkable. But focusing only on them narrows the view. The past was not only the story of palaces, but also of kitchens, markets, workshops, and fields. The lives of women without titles give us a sense of how societies really functioned, and without them, we cannot understand the context in which rulers acted. To recover these stories is not to replace one set of heroes with another, but to see the full picture. When we look at history in this broader way, we also gain insight into the present. Today, discussions of gender equality, representation, and recognition are shaped by the way we understand the past. If we continue to imagine that women mattered only when they wore crowns, we perpetuate a distorted view. But if we acknowledge that women without power shaped economies, cultures, and families, then we open the way to a more inclusive vision of history that honors all contributions. This is not only good for scholarship but also for society, because it affirms that everyone has the capacity to matter. The overlooked tapestry of history is rich, complex, and essential. It is made of countless threads of women's lives that never entered official records, but that held communities together and shaped the course of civilizations. Their stories matter because they complete the picture, challenge false narratives, and honor the truth of human resilience. The few examples we have, poets, philosophers, healers, midwives, merchants, and laborers, are only hints of the vast hidden power that lies beneath the surface. To study and remember them is to finally see history not as the tale of the few, but as the work of the many. It is to honor the truth that humanity's survival and progress have always depended on those who labored quietly but powerfully beyond the palace walls. When we begin to trace the strands of women's influence across history, it becomes clear that power was not always tied to a crown or a throne. It is easy to believe that true authority was reserved for monarchs and those born into noble families, but that assumption ignores the vast network of influence exercised by women whose names rarely appeared in official chronicles. These women worked behind the scenes as advisors, spies, strategists, and mediators, shaping the destinies of nations without ever holding a royal title. Their impact is harder to trace because their work was often hidden by necessity, operating in shadows where secrecy was survival. Yet once we begin to look closely, the evidence emerges that the fates of states, wars, and economies were altered not only by kings and generals, but by women who understood how to move quietly yet effectively in the currents of power. Advisory roles are often overlooked in history because they are not as visible as public decrees or dramatic battles. But advice can shift the course of decisions, especially when offered by someone who has the trust of a leader. Many women in the households of rulers, military commanders, or wealthy merchants held informal authority. They might never appear in official documents, yet their counsel mattered in shaping policy, alliances, and economic strategy. In times when female voices were restricted in public life, private spaces became arenas of influence. A well-placed suggestion at a dinner table could alter the course of negotiations, and a whispered warning could prevent a disastrous decision. These women learned to speak indirectly, often cloaking their insights in language acceptable to their society, but their words still carried weight. Spying and intelligence work provided another avenue of power. Throughout history, women exploited the fact that they were often underestimated in political or military contexts. This very underestimation allowed them to pass unnoticed in spaces where men would have been suspected. They carried messages, gathered intelligence, and sometimes even infiltrated enemy circles. Their work rarely brought them glory, but it often tipped the balance of events. Wars depend not only on armies but also on information, and in this domain, women's contributions were both essential and overlooked. From ancient conflicts to modern wars, records reveal women smuggling letters in baskets, memorizing enemy positions, and relaying secrets that altered strategies. They acted at great personal risk, knowing that discovery meant imprisonment or execution, but they pressed forward out of loyalty, conviction, or necessity. Economic power was another realm where women left their mark, often in ways that transformed communities and influenced the trajectory of entire nations. A woman who managed estates or led a network of merchants could stabilize regions, provide supplies for armies, and fund projects that altered the course of development. While kings signed charters and generals gave commands, the success of their endeavors often depended on resources supplied by women entrepreneurs, landowners, and financiers. These women did not command armies, but they enabled armies to march. They did not sit on thrones, but they ensured that kingdoms could sustain themselves. Their economic foresight and resilience in the face of obstacles highlight the broader truth that nations are shaped as much by logistics and resources as by crowns and ceremonies. One of the most fascinating ways to understand this influence is to look at the battlefield not only as a place of combat, but also as a network of decisions, supplies, and morale. Women, though rarely present in the front lines, shaped battles by ensuring that soldiers had food, clothing, and medicine. They sometimes worked as strategists in less formal roles, offering advice to commanders, disguising themselves to gather intelligence, or coordinating the movement of supplies. When morale faltered, women provided care and encouragement that kept armies from collapsing. The language of war often glorifies bloodshed and heroism, but beneath the surface lies a web of support that made victory possible, and women were central to that web. To move from general observations to concrete reality, it helps to focus on a specific figure whose life demonstrates how a non-royal woman could alter national events. One striking example is Deborah Sampson, who lived during the American Revolution. She was not born into privilege or royalty, but into modest circumstances in Massachusetts in the latter half of the 18th century. Her story is remarkable not only because of her daring actions, but also because of what it reveals about the hidden potential of countless others. Deborah Sampson disguised herself as a man in order to enlist in the Continental Army. Under the name Robert Shirtliff, she served for over a year, participating in skirmishes and enduring the hardships of military life. Her ability to maintain her disguise was a testament to her determination and resilience. During this time, she engaged directly in combat, even sustaining injuries that she treated herself to avoid discovery. Her courage placed her in situations where she influenced the outcome of engagements that contributed to the larger struggle for independence. Though she did not advise generals or sit in councils, her very presence on the battlefield challenged assumptions about who could fight and demonstrated that the will to defend a cause was not confined to men. Her story also highlights the broader theme of hidden female influence. For every Deborah Sampson whose actions were later discovered and recorded, there were countless others whose identities remain unknown. Women carried intelligence between camps, disguised themselves to fight, and took on responsibilities left vacant by men at war. Their efforts sustained the revolutionary movement and gave it the resilience needed to continue against overwhelming odds. In Deborah's case, recognition eventually came in the form of a military pension, making her one of the few women officially acknowledged for her service. But her recognition is exceptional precisely because most women who contributed in similar ways remained unnamed and forgotten. Beyond the battlefield, women like Deborah influenced economic and political decisions in subtle but significant ways. The American Revolution depended not only on soldiers but also on supplies, trade, and networks of communication. Women managed farms, ran businesses, and organized boycotts that deprived British goods of colonial markets. These economic acts were as much a form of resistance as military engagements, yet they often receive less attention. The collective power of these actions shows how women, without holding titles or commanding armies, shaped the conditions that allowed a nation to emerge. Deborah's story, set within this broader context, becomes a lens through which we can glimpse the hidden strength of countless others. Her example also reminds us that influence is not limited to visible authority. By stepping into a role society denied her, Deborah exposed the artificial boundaries of gender in the realm of national defense. Her story resonated long after the war ended, inspiring later generations to question assumptions about women's abilities and rights. She may not have altered a specific policy in the way a royal advisor might, but she shifted cultural perception, which is itself a form of national transformation. Nations are not shaped only by laws and battles, but also by the evolving beliefs of their citizens, and in this realm, Deborah's contribution was profound. Looking at her story alongside the hidden efforts of other women reveals a pattern. Women without crowns or titles acted as quiet architects of history. They advised in private, spied in secrecy, labored in fields, and fought in disguise. They stabilized economies, sustained revolutions, and nurtured cultural continuity. Their names may not appear in official lists of rulers, but their influence rippled across societies. To understand history fully, we must acknowledge this unseen labor and this hidden power. Only then can we see how nations were truly shaped, not only by thrones, but by the countless hands that worked beyond them. The idea of women shaping nations through advisory roles, espionage, strategy, and economic power leads naturally into another domain where their influence was both profound and often overlooked. Beyond the immediate pressures of war, diplomacy, and statecraft, there were revolutions that unfolded in quieter ways, through the slow but powerful reshaping of culture, thought, and social order. These revolutions did not always declare themselves with fanfare or violence, yet they altered the very fabric of society. Women who were not born to royal families became catalysts for change by spearheading social movements, advancing new ideas, and producing works of art and literature that questioned long-standing norms. Their efforts reveal another dimension of the overlooked tapestry of history. The power to ignite change not through the throne, but through imagination, persistence, and vision. The term revolution often brings to mind battles and political upheaval, but cultural revolutions begin with conversations, gatherings, and works of expression that slowly change how people think. Women who organized communities, challenged traditions, or created new forms of art often planted seeds that grew into movements with far-reaching consequences. Their voices might not have been heard in official parliaments or assemblies, yet they reached audiences through writing, performance, or activism. In this way, they carried out revolutions in daily life, altering how society saw morality, justice, beauty, and freedom. What makes these contributions especially striking is that they were achieved despite restrictions on women's education, mobility, and rights. Against these obstacles, their influence demonstrates resilience as well as creativity. One area where women's cultural influence is unmistakable is in the history of literature and the arts. Long before female authors were widely recognized, Women were writing novels, essays, plays, and poetry that revealed the limitations of their societies and offered visions of something different. Sometimes they did so under pseudonyms or anonymously, aware that open authorship could bring ridicule or even punishment. But their words carried a quiet force that slowly altered perspectives. In the salons of Europe during the Enlightenment, for example, women hosted gatherings where philosophers, writers, and scientists debated ideas. Though often remembered for their hospitality, these women were not passive facilitators. They guided discussions, introduced thinkers to one another, and sometimes steered conversations toward questions that might otherwise have been ignored. In doing so, they shaped the intellectual climate in which revolutions in politics and science took root. It is also important to remember that cultural innovation was not limited to Europe. Across continents, women shaped artistic and social life in ways that redefined traditions. In Africa, women often served as griots, oral historians who carried the collective memory of their communities through song and storytelling. In Asia, women contributed to the refinement of literature, music, and philosophy, sometimes working in circles where their names were never recorded, but their influence resonated through generations. In the Americas, women preserved indigenous traditions in the face of colonization, ensuring that languages, rituals, and knowledge systems survived. These contributions may not fit neatly into the framework of political revolutions, but they represent cultural revolutions of equal significance because they defended identity and transformed values. The arts, however, were only one avenue of quiet revolution. Social movements often began with women who recognized injustices and refused to accept them. They did not hold thrones, but they organized petitions, gatherings, and campaigns that altered laws and challenged entrenched systems. Movements for the abolition of slavery, for labor rights, and for women's suffrage all relied on non-royal women whose dedication turned ideals into action. Their work was often slow and thankless, facing ridicule and opposition, yet it built momentum until change became inevitable. These women show that revolutions need not be dramatic to be powerful. They can grow quietly, gathering strength through persistence until they transform entire societies. Within these broader movements, individual figures stand out as examples of how one person's determination can inspire widespread transformation. One such figure is Sojourner Truth, a woman born into slavery in New York in the late 18th century who became one of the most powerful voices for abolition and women's rights in 19th century America. She was not a queen, nor did she hold any position of formal authority, yet her influence was extraordinary. Through speeches, activism, and her sheer presence, she ignited cultural and social shifts that reshaped the American landscape. Sojourner Truth was born Isabella Baumfree in the year 1797. Her early life was marked by hardship, as she was sold multiple times and endured the cruelty of enslavement. Yet she carried within her a resilience that could not be broken. In 1826, she escaped with her infant daughter, leaving behind bondage to claim freedom. This act alone was a revolution in her personal life, but she did not stop there. She changed her name to Sojourner Truth, reflecting her mission to travel and speak the truth about injustice. With little formal education, she relied on her powerful oratory, drawing on religious conviction and personal experience to captivate audiences. Her speeches revealed both the cruelty of slavery and the hypocrisy of a society that proclaimed liberty while denying it to so many. She spoke not in the abstract language of political theory, but in the vivid voice of lived experience. This authenticity gave her words immense power, convincing audiences who might otherwise have dismissed arguments for abolition. She challenged listeners to confront the humanity of those enslaved, undermining the stereotypes and justifications that sustained the system. In this way, she contributed to a cultural revolution that shifted public opinion and gave strength to the abolitionist movement. Yet Sojourner Truth did more than fight slavery. She also became a leading voice for women's rights. In 1851, she delivered her most famous speech at a women's convention in Akron, Ohio, where she questioned the narrow definitions of womanhood that excluded women of color. Her words, often remembered as "Ain't I a Woman," demanded recognition of the full humanity of all women, not only those who fit the ideals of white, middle-class femininity. In challenging both racial and gender inequality simultaneously, she broadened the scope of the women's rights movement and ensured that its future would be tied to broader questions of justice. Her vision was not limited to political rights alone, but extended to a cultural transformation in how society defined dignity and equality. Sojourner Truth's impact was not limited to speeches. She met with presidents, including Abraham Lincoln, and campaigned for the recruitment of black soldiers during the Civil War. She also worked to secure land and employment for freed people after emancipation, recognizing that true freedom required economic as well as legal rights. In each of these efforts, she acted without formal office or wealth, relying instead on determination, charisma, and the force of her convictions. Her life demonstrates how a non-royal woman, starting from the lowest rungs of society, could influence national events and shape cultural attitudes. Her story fits into the larger pattern of quiet revolutions led by women. She did not command armies or issue decrees, yet she altered the course of history by changing minds and inspiring action. Her courage revealed the possibility of new social orders, and her persistence ensured that those possibilities were pursued. Through her, we see how revolutions in culture and society are often sparked not by dramatic moments alone, but by the steady voice of someone willing to speak the truth despite all obstacles. The example of Sojourner Truth also connects with the broader theme of how nations are shaped not only by those who sit on thrones, but by those who ignite cultural change. Her words outlasted the political debates of her time, echoing in movements for civil rights and gender equality long after her death. She stands as a reminder that cultural revolutions often outlive political ones, because they alter the very ways in which people think and imagine the world. By planting ideas of justice, equality, and dignity, she contributed to transformations that continue to unfold today. This case, alongside countless others across cultures, shows us that the story of human progress cannot be confined to royal courts or battlefields. Women without titles sparked revolutions of thought, art, and activism that reshaped societies from within. They were the intellectual giants, the innovators, the organizers, and the dreamers whose quiet revolutions reverberated through time. To honor their contributions is to recognize the full scope of history, not as the tale of a few powerful rulers, but as the collective work of those who dared to challenge the limits placed upon them. The thread that binds these stories together is the realization that women who were not queens or princesses have always stood at the center of history, even if the record rarely admits it. From those who advised rulers in secrecy, to those who spied and fought in disguise, to those who lit cultural fires through words and movements, their influence reached into the deepest corners of society. Yet another layer of this overlooked tapestry lies in the women who became guardians of knowledge and justice during times when both were in peril. While battles raged and dynasties rose and fell, knowledge itself, science, literature, history, philosophy, often teetered on the edge of disappearance. Laws and customs, too, frequently left the marginalized without defenders. In those moments, women who were not royals stepped forward as keepers and advocates, ensuring that humanity did not lose its memory or its conscience. The preservation of knowledge has rarely been a straightforward task. Great libraries have burned, manuscripts have been destroyed, and generations of wisdom have been threatened by conquest, censorship, or neglect. It is in such times that the quiet labor of women often made the difference between memory and oblivion. In monasteries, convents, and private households, women copied manuscripts, translated works, and passed down oral traditions. Their work was often hidden under the anonymity of scribes or overshadowed by the fame of male scholars, yet without their persistence, many texts would not have survived. A single copy of a book kept in a convent cell or hidden in a family chest could later provide the foundation for entire fields of study. The act of preserving a text may not appear revolutionary, but when knowledge is the seed of progress, preservation is itself an act of resistance. At times, women preserved knowledge not by copying it, but by living it. Healers, midwives, and herbalists carried medical traditions that had been passed down for centuries. They preserved scientific observation in the form of practical remedies, plant lore, and treatments for illness. When official institutions dismissed or persecuted them, these women nevertheless kept their knowledge alive, handing it to daughters or apprentices. Much of what later became part of modern medicine has roots in this lineage of practical wisdom. The fact that their names are mostly forgotten does not erase their role as living libraries, sustaining knowledge through dark ages of suspicion and suppression. Preserving literature and cultural memory was equally important. In times of conquest and displacement, women often became the custodians of songs, stories, and rituals. These oral traditions kept alive the histories of peoples who might otherwise have been erased. A lullaby or tale told at a hearth could carry encoded lessons, values, and memories of ancestry, passing them quietly from one generation to the next. These acts were not recognized as scholarship, yet they performed the essential task of keeping identities intact through upheaval. Without them, the cultural continuity of many societies would have been severed. Just as some women became guardians of knowledge, others took on the equally vital role of advocates for justice. In societies where the law was written by men and for men, women often had little official standing. Yet they found ways to argue for fairness, to challenge corruption, and to defend the vulnerable. Some did so through direct action, representing others in court or petitioning authorities. Others did so by creating networks of support for the marginalized, whether through religious institutions, charitable work, or social reform movements. In each case, they acted without the recognition or power of royalty, but their influence reshaped societies by insisting on the principles of equity and compassion. These efforts were not without danger. Women who challenged legal norms risked ridicule, punishment, or exile. Yet their persistence reveals the depth of their conviction that justice mattered, even in systems designed to silence them. Their courage paved the way for later generations of reformers, creating a lineage of advocacy that stretched across centuries. They may not have drafted constitutions, but they defended the conscience of humanity in moments when it was most threatened. One striking case that illuminates both the preservation of knowledge and the fight for justice is that of Anna Julia Cooper, an African-American scholar, educator, and activist in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. She was not born into wealth or power. She was born into slavery in North Carolina in the year 1858. Yet through extraordinary resilience and intellect, she became one of the most influential thinkers of her time, ensuring that both knowledge and justice were advanced despite the barriers placed before her. Anna Julia Cooper's early life was shaped by the reality of oppression, but also by the pursuit of education. After the Civil War, she enrolled at St. Augustine's Normal School and Collegiate Institute, where she distinguished herself as a student and later as a teacher. Her hunger for learning led her to Oberlin College, one of the few institutions at the time willing to admit black women. There she earned both a bachelor's and a master's degree, and later, she became only the fourth African-American woman to earn a doctoral degree, which she received from the University of Paris in 1924. Her educational journey itself was a triumph, but it was her use of knowledge that made her legacy enduring. Through her teaching and writing, Anna Julia Cooper became a fierce advocate for the education of African-American women, insisting that their intellectual development was essential not only for their own advancement, but for the progress of the entire nation. In her seminal book, A Voice from the South, published in 1892, she argued passionately for the importance of black women's voices in shaping society. She pointed out that true justice and equality could not be achieved unless all marginalized voices were included. Her vision combined the preservation of knowledge with the advancement of justice, showing that the two were inseparable. By insisting that African-American women be given access to education, she was preserving and expanding the intellectual resources of a community that had long been excluded from formal learning. Anna Julia Cooper's role as an educator also demonstrates the quiet but profound influence of teaching. She spent much of her life as a teacher and principal at schools for black students, where she nurtured generations of young minds. In doing so, she not only preserved knowledge but also multiplied it, ensuring that it spread to communities that had been denied access for centuries. Each student she taught became a carrier of ideas, a contributor to the intellectual life of the nation. This multiplier effect is one of the most powerful forms of influence, and it is often overlooked because it lacks the drama of political office. Yet it is in classrooms, not only in legislatures, that the foundations of justice and progress are built. Her advocacy was not limited to education. She also spoke and wrote on issues of racial and gender equality more broadly, challenging the exclusion of women and people of color from public life. Her insistence that black women's perspectives were essential to understanding justice was a radical claim in an era when their voices were systematically silenced. By articulating this vision, she helped to reshape the intellectual and cultural framework of her society. Her ideas laid groundwork for later movements in civil rights and feminism, demonstrating how one woman without royal status could influence the trajectory of justice and knowledge for generations. What makes Anna Julia Cooper's story especially powerful is how it connects the themes of preservation and transformation. She preserved knowledge by ensuring that education reached those who had been denied it, and she advanced justice by demanding that society recognize the voices of the marginalized. She did not do this from a throne or through formal power, but through the steady force of intellect, teaching, and advocacy. Her life is a reminder that the guardians of knowledge and justice are often those whose names are not inscribed in monuments, but whose influence reverberates in the minds and lives of those they touched. Looking at her story alongside the broader efforts of women across history, it becomes clear that the survival of knowledge and the pursuit of justice have always depended on unsung figures. They were the women who copied texts in candlelight, who whispered stories into the ears of children, who healed the sick with remedies passed down through generations, who stood in courts to demand fairness, and who taught students who would go on to transform the world. Their labor was quiet, their recognition minimal, but their impact immeasurable. To acknowledge them is not only to give them honor, but to tell the truth about how humanity has endured and progressed. The pattern that emerges from these stories, whether of advisors, spies, cultural innovators, or guardians of knowledge and justice, is that power takes many forms. Thrones and crowns are only one form, and perhaps not even the most enduring. Influence flows through words, through teaching, through persistence, through preservation. Women who were denied official recognition nevertheless became the pillars on which societies rested. Without them, knowledge would have been lost, justice ignored, and culture impoverished. With them, humanity survived dark times and found new paths forward. The stories of advisors, strategists, cultural innovators, preservers of knowledge, and advocates for justice do not rest only in the past. They continue to echo in the present, shaping the way we understand ourselves and our possibilities. Every woman who copied a manuscript in obscurity, every activist who demanded justice, every teacher who nurtured young minds without recognition left behind more than just a trace of her own existence. She contributed to a living legacy that informs our institutions, our movements, and our ideals today. The courage of women who preserve texts ensures that we still read the wisdom of earlier ages. The persistence of those who fought for fairness reminds us that justice is never handed down from thrones, but must be demanded and defended by people willing to challenge entrenched systems. The cultural shifts sparked by women who wrote, painted, and organized echo in today's debates over identity, equality, and representation. Their lives were not footnotes, they were foundations. The resonance of their actions can be seen in the ways movements for equality continue to draw upon their words and deeds. When modern activists insist on representation for marginalized voices, they stand on ground prepared by women like Anna Julia Cooper, who argued in the 19th century that the voices of African American women were essential to justice. When advocates for peace speak against the destruction of war, they echo the quiet resistance of women who, in past centuries, kept families alive and cultures intact while empires fought. The continuity is striking. The tools may change, the language may evolve, but the spirit of persistence that carried women through centuries of silence continues to animate struggles today. Their stories provide not only inspiration but also instruction, showing how resilience, creativity, and solidarity can create change even under the harshest conditions. This connection between past and present also helps us challenge the traditional narratives that still dominate history. For too long, the telling of the past has been confined to the exploits of rulers, generals, and conquerors. This narrow vision not only distorts the truth, but also limits our imagination of what matters. By bringing forward the stories of women who were not royalty, we expand the boundaries of history to include the majority of humanity. We recognize that societies were shaped not only by decrees and battles, but by the countless acts of labor, thought, and courage carried out by those without power. This shift has profound implications for how we view our world. If history is the story of everyone, then each person's contribution matters. If women without crowns shaped nations, then so too can ordinary people today shape the future. This recognition democratizes history and empowers us to see ourselves as agents of change. The task of challenging traditional narratives is ongoing, because erasure is not only a problem of the past. Even now, the contributions of women, especially those from marginalized communities, are often minimized or ignored. Modern media, scholarship, and politics still sometimes focus on a narrow set of voices, leaving others in obscurity. To correct this imbalance, we must actively seek out diverse perspectives, question whose stories are told, and make space for voices that have been silenced. This is not merely a matter of fairness. It is a matter of truth. Without these perspectives, our understanding of history is incomplete. With them, we gain a richer, more accurate, and more inspiring picture of humanity. The importance of diverse historical perspectives is also evident in education. When young people learn only about kings, generals, and presidents, they may come to believe that influence requires wealth, inheritance, or armies. But when they hear about women who shaped culture through art, preserved knowledge in times of destruction, or advanced justice against all odds, they learn that influence takes many forms. They see that change is possible from unexpected places, and that their own lives can matter even without titles or fame. This lesson is invaluable because it fosters not only respect for the past, but also hope for the future. It teaches us that history is not something distant or reserved for the powerful, but something each generation participates in. The enduring legacy of these unsung heroines also challenges us to reflect on the ways we honor memory. Statues and monuments often celebrate military victories or royal figures, but the preservation of culture, the defense of justice, and the nurturing of knowledge rarely receive such recognition. Perhaps it is time to reconsider what we choose to commemorate. Imagine public spaces that honor healers, teachers, and advocates, not only rulers and generals. Imagine museums that highlight the stories of those who preserved books, defended the vulnerable, and carried traditions through centuries of upheaval. By shifting what we honor, we reshape collective memory and ensure that the sacrifices and contributions of unsung heroines are not forgotten again. As we look to the future, the relevance of these stories becomes even clearer. The challenges of our time, climate change, inequality, conflict, and cultural fragmentation, cannot be solved by a few leaders alone. They require the collective effort of communities and the resilience of ordinary people. The example of women who shaped history without thrones shows us the power of persistence, creativity, and solidarity. Their legacy offers a guide for how we might face the crises of our own age. By valuing knowledge, defending justice, and sustaining culture even in times of darkness. Just as they carried memory through destruction, we too must preserve and protect what is essential for those who come after us. This legacy also invites us to act. To read these stories is not only to admire the past, but to recognize a responsibility. Each hidden story we uncover restores dignity to a life that mattered. Each overlooked contribution we acknowledge strengthens the truth of history, and each act of remembering resists the silence that once erased them. Supporting research, education, and cultural projects that highlight these narratives ensures that the tapestry of history becomes fuller and more honest. Encouraging diverse voices in literature, scholarship, and media continues the work of expanding perspectives. In this way, honoring the unsung heroines of the past becomes a living practice, shaping how we tell stories today and tomorrow. The invitation, then, is simple yet profound. Discover more, listen more, and tell more. Seek out the stories of women who did not wear crowns, but who shaped the world. Share them in classrooms, communities, and families so that they become part of the collective memory. Support initiatives that uncover marginalized voices, whether through archives, oral histories, or artistic projects. Recognize that every life carries meaning, and that history is richer when it includes the many rather than the few. By doing so, we do more than honor the past. We strengthen our present and prepare for a future built on truth, inclusion, and respect. In the end, the enduring legacy of these women is not confined to what they did centuries ago. It lives in the possibilities they opened, the lessons they taught, and the courage they demonstrated. They remind us that thrones are not the only sources of power, that knowledge can survive even in hiding, that justice can be pursued even by those denied a voice, and that culture can be preserved through the quiet strength of storytelling, teaching, and care. They remind us that influence is not measured only in crowns and armies, but in resilience and vision. And they call us to continue their work, to carry forward the threads of their tapestry into a future where no story is left untold. Thus, as we conclude this reflection on the overlooked tapestry of history, we recognize that it is far from complete. Much remains hidden, waiting to be uncovered. The stories of countless women are still buried in forgotten letters, unmarked graves, or unrecorded traditions. Our task is to bring them to light, to weave them back into the fabric of our shared memory. In doing so, we honor not only them but also ourselves, because we acknowledge that history belongs to all of us. Their legacy is enduring, and our future will be stronger if we embrace it fully.